Lesson 7, some classic approaches to thinking about God's power and wisdom. This will begin an introduction or a discussion that'll take 2 lessons where we work our way through some of what are known as the classic attributes of God. And when we think about God, we think about the ultimate, right? We think about the divine. We think about our human categories sort of raised to infinity, but we try to point in the direction of God as God is. The one thing that I think is very important at the very beginning of such a discussion is for us to understand that our ideas about God are just that. They're ideas about God, and those ideas are not God. Those ideas can never express the totality of the infinite reality that is God. And so when we say things like God is, and then put some label after it, I do think it is just important for us to always understand that we're not saying we've defined exactly the limits of God. What we've done is we've pointed in the direction. We say things like God is all powerful, God is all knowing, God is everywhere, God is. Then what we've done is we've pointed in a direction for human understanding to reach toward the divine. We've not defined who God is. And those ideas are not the ultimate reality. They're not God's self. They're just our ideas about that reality. And that there is a real being, a real personality, let's say, that's beyond all of our ideas. And one of the unique beauties of the Christian faith is that we actually believe that it's possible for us in our limited human state to have a relationship with, and therefore to know in that personal way, that divine reality, that ultimate reality that we call God. But we still work on talking about who God is and how we understand God. One of the first things we're going to posit is what, in quoting some of Thomas Oden's work, the author of this course quotes and uses the term aseity, which is a wonderful English word that nobody uses for anything unless you probably study theology or some pretty deep philosophy. And aseity is this concept that God and only God can be the source of his own being. God is. Another way of saying this that I just want to sort of bring to your attention because you might hear it somewhere is that God is the only simple thing in the universe. Now that is using a technical physics term, simple, which means having no parts, right? A wholeness, a system, a physical system is simple the fewer parts that it has. And when you get to where you have no parts, remember God has no parts. I've said that a time or two now. Just remember God has no parts. This will be an important concept. If I was giving you a test, describe this part of God, and somebody should write in the margin, this is not a valid question or something like that to get extra points or something. So God is. And how do we talk about God who is? God who is the only uncreated creator, the only non-dependent entity in existence. Well, there have been 2 classical approaches to how we do that. And one is the via negativa. You just got to love, we can't get away from these Latin labels, but the way of the negative, or the road of negation. You could sort of translate it either way. And when we do that, we talk about what God is not, right? You just read a little bit. One way is the way of negativity, often called the via negativa. It arrives at a kind of knowledge of God by embracing what God is not. One negotiates this path, says Ogden, by constantly saying, no, God is not finite, limited in any way, bound by time, subject to death and corruption, and so forth. The older hymn, Immortal, Invisible, God Only Wise, expresses this insight poetically. Hint, hint. James's mostest favoritist hymn of all, Immortal, Invisible, by the way. Immortal, invisible, God only wise, in light inaccessible, hid from our eyes. Most blessed, most glorious, the Ancient of Days, almighty, victorious, thy great name we praise. Think about how many negations are in that one stanza. Immortal, not mortal, not subject to death. Invisible, not visible. God only wise, in light, inaccessible, inaccessible. All of those negations, what God is not. So every time we say one of those M or N prefixed words, those are negative prefixes, mean God is not mortal, God is not visible, God is not able to be reached. That's inaccessible. Not accessible to our senses, let's put it that way. We could also say things like God is immaterial, incorporeal, having no body, although then we have to account for Jesus. Immutable, not subject to change. Indivisible, cannot be divided into parts. Did I say God has no parts? Indivisible. Immeasurable, and as mentioned above, infinite. And so in much of our language about trying to talk about God, we use words like this, describing what God is not. There is another way, the opposite way, one might expect, and that is to look at the finite world around us and to magnify its qualities until they are fit to be associated with God. This is the way of immanence, or the via, I never can hardly get this one out without even getting tongue-tied, right? The via immanentiae, I believe. And I'm always confused because I hear things. Anyway, do we use the Oxford Latin pronunciation? Or, forget it. Just the way of immanence. In this way, we take things that we know about, things in the world and in humankind, and we construct a scale of degrees of excellence. And we say things like, God is better than the best we can know. God, is stronger than our strength. I think that's almost biblical. Wiser than man's wisdom. Or even in an interesting, in the biblical way, it's an interesting sort of combination. God's weakness is stronger than man's strength, right? God's foolishness is wiser than man's wisdom, which is that way of immanence, still using things that we know, things common in our world, things that are characteristic even of humans, and raising them to a degree of excellence where they can be applied to God. And probably the via negativa, the way of the negative, has been used most commonly throughout history in talking about God. For everybody that messes around with a little psychology, I'll just tell you that that's somewhat problematic, always describing things by what they are not. The brain doesn't necessarily process those super well. So it's maybe more challenging for us as practical theologians to try to figure out how to talk about what God is using the via immanence. The classic attributes of God we're going to discuss in this lesson: power and wisdom, and how we talk about those. And the words that are most commonly associated in that discussion are omnipotent, which means all powerful, and omniscient, meaning all knowing, aware of all things. Omnipotent and omniscient. In the Christian faith, we believe we know God most completely and correctly in Jesus Christ, the eternal Son of God. In him, God became incarnate in his fullness. All language regarding God must be judged according to Christ. We may speak with confidence based on the biblical record the witness of Jesus Christ, and the enablement of the Holy Spirit. At the same time, there is a measure of truth in what Frederick Schmidt writes. Our pictures of God are and should be forever provisional, shifting to meet both narrower and larger needs, grasping more of the nature of God on some level, while at the same time acknowledging that they are less than can ever be known. Again, I'll go back to that earlier statement. As we talk about God's power, and probably always when talking about God, it's important to keep that framework that says, whatever we've said, we've not said it all, not understood all of who God is, the power of God. How should we think about God's power? Should the Christian uphold the received conventional view that God is all powerful, which in traditional languages is, of course, God's omnipotence? Everybody's jumping on that one to answer and say things, I see. Christian theology is never done in a vacuum, cultural, social, or political isolation. And it's not done within an isolation of language. And so when we say God is all powerful, we have to sometimes be careful about what we mean about power, what it is we mean when we say God is all powerful. We can have these wonderful discussions about, can God is all powerful, so can he make a rock so big he can't move it? Isn't that fun? Can God, I've answered all of these questions, by the way.
Yeah, I like the feather one also,
Yeah. Can God make a rock so big he can't move it? Right there.
Why?
Not, and what happens when an immovable object is impacted by an unstoppable force, That's kind of along the same, except I would suggest to you we can have even more fun than that. Try this one on for size. The answer to all of the questions about can God are yes. God is all powerful. And when the answer to all of those questions is yes, why even ask them? And so I think far more important from a practical standpoint ends up being the question, what will God do, as opposed to what can God do? I used to always just thwart all the philosophy majors that say things like, let's talk about whether or not God can make a rock so big he can't move. And I'd say, of course, the answer is yes. The question begins, can God? And so the answer is yes. Let's move on. Why or will questions end up being more important. And so with that idea, we do have to come around to sort of figuring out what do we mean when we talk about God's power, God being all powerful. And sooner or later, I'm going to get around to talking a little bit about Calvinism again, because I think on this topic, we have to address Calvin's theology again. God's power, responsible theologians agree, is not simply the naked power of brute force. Make no mistake, God possesses that sort of power. Were God not in possession of all power, a literal meaning of omnipotent, then God would not be God. Again, James's lovely philosophical answer, can God? The answer is yes. Just you don't even need to tell me the rest of the question. It's just, will he? Because I do believe God is all powerful. A classic statement that expresses this well comes from John of Damascus, an 8th century theologian, often called the last of the great Eastern Orthodox thinkers. He asserted, God can do all that he wills, even though he does not will all things that he can do. For he can destroy creation, but he does not will to do so. Again, so I come around to that question. What will God do? Well, God can do all that he wills to do. And there are just a lot of things he can do, he just wills not to do. So John simply, this is John of Damascus, Eastern Orthodox theologian, simply means there are some things God chooses not to do, even though it remains within his sovereign power to will to do them. And what God can will, God can perform. Well, I skipped some of these citations that are listed in the book. So just understand if you go back and read the lectures as they're printed in the books, I skipped some of that stuff. Some have gone so far as to claim the Bible teaches that God must be the ultimate author of sin, because to deny this would be to limit God's power. Today, however, the trend is very much in the opposite direction. Responsible 20th century theologians such as Karl Barth, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Jürgen Moltmann teach that God's power is always in service to his love. Power that disregards love might be called naked power, which stresses God's almightiness. Barth believed almightiness was a heresy because it left no room for God to extend himself in love toward the wounded creature. Needy power, wherein to one degree or another God needs human love in order to be completed in his own person, might be contrasted with naked power. Although Bloch believes God will stop at nothing to redeem us, he discounts needy power, saying that God does not need our love, but he loves us. I will now take a little aside and remind you of John Calvin. And I think that it's one of the things that I'm not sure we do a whole lot of, although in our Christian History 1 and 2, I hope that you get a good smattering of this, and that is that you get sort of a touchstone with other major theological systems other than our own. Learning about Wesleyanism and, frankly, mainstream Orthodox Christianity, very important. And if you're going to learn one thing, then that's the one thing you learn, right? You learn sort of our path. But there are other paths. There are other theologies that have grown up in the greater Christendom. And what I would hope is that in time you'd be inspired to learn more about them, some to agree with and some to disagree with. In our area, okay, in the Bible Belt, maybe in the United States in general, but certainly in the Bible Belt of the South, we come face to face with some form of Calvinism on a regular basis. Right? It is the strongest Baptist, let's just say, which is always an interesting thing to me, right? Why are they known as Baptist when what they really are is Anabaptist? You have to figure that one out, right? What Anabaptist? That's a not, right? Anabaptist means not baptism, and most importantly, not infant baptism, which the Baptist, what became known as Baptist in the United States, they grow out of that Anabaptist, that not infant baptism, believers only baptism world, and sometimes even more strictly understood than that, because being strictly congregational, each church can sort of in its own way decide that it needs to use baptism the way it wants to use it. So a lot of Baptist churches use baptism as a right of membership into a local congregation, as opposed to a broader Christian baptism, which we would teach in our doctrine. Right? I don't need to rebaptize somebody because they were baptized in the Catholic Church, or they were baptized in the Baptist Church, or for that matter, in the Church of Christ, or if they were baptized in a Christian church, baptized a Christian, we would accept that baptism is valid. And go ahead.
Question on that. As you know, I was rebaptized in the Nazarene faith because I felt that I was baptized in the Catholic Church, but I was baptized at a point in my life that I was way too young to even have a decision to make. And to me, being baptized as a matured person, so to speak, it gave me the ability to be accountable for my decision to dedicate my life to Christ.
So I'm going to give you the theological and not the pastoral answer. And then I'll work backwards to the pastoral answer, okay? The theological answer would be we never really rebaptize anybody. If you were baptized a Christian, you were baptized. Now, we may reenact that baptism, but did we really baptize? And think about it this way. Is the reality of baptism ever about you and your decision? Or is it really a testimony to God's grace at work in your life?
Well, I find that a good question, and I answer it this way. when I was baptized, there was a fear that if I wasn't baptized as a baby, I would not have been able to ever go to heaven, because in the Catholic Church, there was a thing called limbo.
Yep.
And any babies that were not baptized in the Catholic faith, if they died, they did not go to heaven. They went to limbo. That's why I believed that I was baptized as a child. That's why I didn't give a lot of stock when I finally started to understand Jesus Christ and how God works.
Well, and so you understand, there is an entire tradition within Christendom that rejects infant baptism, and they're known as Anabaptists. And, well, Nazarenes don't fall under that camp. We accept infant baptism as a Christian practice. We accept it actually on different terms than the Catholic Church. Catholic Church, I don't know, eventually we'll probably talk about sacraments, but I think that's in the second half of this class. In the Catholic faith, frankly, I believe in the Eastern Orthodox faith, and also very likely the general understanding within the Anglican tradition follows the same line, and that is that baptism, period, whenever it occurs, whether at infancy or otherwise, that baptism removes original sin. And in that sense, that baptism, that doctrine or that teaching about baptism is not the one we embrace when we baptize infants. We believe that baptism is the sign and seal of the new covenant, that it is effectively the declaration that, God has, in the case of a believer, saved me, and I want the world to know that I've chosen to follow Jesus. That's believer's baptism. That's the easiest one to articulate. Our stance on infant baptism is a little more complex in that we believe that God's prevenient grace is already at work. And my statement to my brother Steve would be, even in the fear of your parents who chose to have you baptized as an infant in a Catholic church, God's prevenient grace was already at work in your life. Provision for your salvation had been made when Jesus died on the cross. And whether fear or, in what we would hope would be the case of parents in our tradition, a declaration of their faith that God's provision had been made or has been made for their child, and they present that child for baptism, it really is a foreshadowing of what they hope will become reality for that child. And so I say to a person that's been baptized as an infant, you absolutely can rightly choose to embrace your baptism as an infant, as your Christian baptism. You were, as it were, sealed ahead of time. You were marked with the sacrament of baptism, maybe before you realized the full reality of what was going on. But isn't that the case with every Christian sacrament that we partake of? Isn't that true of communion? When we take communion, have we fully understood the depths? It's almost the same rationale I give to a parent or someone when they want to talk to me about, can a 5-year-old be saved? I mean, they don't really understand everything that's going on, which my normal answer is, I'm really not sure I understand everything that's going on in salvation, right? I don't think that precludes me from being able to trust Jesus to do things I don't even understand yet, right? So, well, that was a little digression into baptism. I don't have a problem pastorally. Some people do. I don't. I don't have a problem pastorally with reenacting someone's baptism. I kind of fall into that school of I'd rather see somebody ride the altar to heaven than sit the pew to hell. If a person needs to come forward and be saved every Sunday for the rest of their life, well, then just let them come forward and pray. that kind of keeps them going. Let's keep our eyes on the prize and not get too lost in technicality. And if, being dunked in the water makes a person walk a little closer to Jesus, why don't we just line up at the pool every Sunday and get dunked? I mean, I don't really mean to make light of that. It's just the reality that if a person, Steve, if a person in your situation, just for whatever reason, ends up feeling like I just don't believe my baptism was valid. Well, let's help that person feel like their baptism is valid. We can salve our theological conscience by saying to ourselves under our breath, I reenact your baptism in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and only come out with, I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In the water, and out you come, right? I mean, or you get sprinkled or you get poured, because we accept all three modes of baptism. And anyway, that's another one of those wonderful discussions we can have someday about, immersion or sprinkling or pouring. We do, as a denomination, accept all three and practice all three modes. And this is my place to remind you that when you make application for your district license and when you make application for ordination, you are asked to answer the question, are you in full sympathy, meaning complete agreement with the doctrines and practices of the Church of the Nazarene? And if you're going to be one of those preachers, and I'm not going to name any names, but I know some, who, one, doesn't think that sprinkling or pouring are valid forms of baptism, then please do not lie on your ordination application and say that you agree with the teachings of the Church of the Nazarene if you don't. I think it's bad for preachers to lie. I think it may be wrong in God's eyes for anybody to lie, but I think it's especially wrong for ministers to lie, especially when it comes to things like that. We can have a little fun there, but that's really, I feel that way. You should not lie on your application if you're not in agreement with the teachings of the Church of the Nazarene. Same thing for women being ordained, fully ordained in the clergy. If you don't believe, and there are ordained Nazarene ministers out there that do not agree with our position that women should be ordained, and they lied at some point in their life and should not have been ordained in the Church of the Nazarene. And they should have not been ordained because they lied, not just because they didn't agree with our theology. It's possible that somebody in high position might disagree with our stance on that, and they might not like the way I talk about them, but that's just the way it is. You said you agreed with the Church of the Nazarene, and you didn't? Well, that wasn't being truthful, was it? All right, I'm through with that tirade. I'll move on. Remember, I mentioned Calvin's theology in an earlier lecture, and I just think it's worth, in our discussion of the power of God and how we talk about God's power, being reminded that John Calvin in his Institutes, his formal work of systematic theology, and I forget how many volumes there are in that, like 20 or something, takes up a whole shelf. He begins with the ultimate premise that God is sovereign. You ever heard a good Baptist minister preach about the sovereignty of God? Let me tell you, it's hard to beat them because they really know how to preach about the sovereignty of God. And that sovereignty of God in that model really is this: God is the only power in the universe. God ultimately holds all the cards. And this statement that some have gone so far as to claim that the Bible teaches that God must be the ultimate author of sin, because to deny this would be to limit God's power. Well, if God is the only decision maker in the universe, basically if everything that ever happens, God has to say, yes, I want that to happen to, then ultimately God is the author of sin. God created that which is bad in that model. And we have to come to, one, a different understanding about what evil is, and two, I think we have to understand that God's power is more along the lines of God can do whatever he wills to do. And so God is, while we can sort of say philosophically God's power is unlimited, the answer to can God is always yes. We can say that from a philosophical standpoint, but on a more practical and really on a more theological note, God's power is limited when God chooses to limit it. Get that? That's a lot of careful talk, technical wording, but God can do what God wills to do, but God doesn't will to do everything he can do. What we've heard. And that keeps us out of the problem of God being the author of evil and sin. The other, just as again, off the topic of God's power, but another way of coming at that is to understand evil not as an affirmatively existing thing like rocks and trees and you and me, but as a negation of something that is. Therefore, God didn't have to create it for it to be, because it doesn't have positive existence. It's a not an is, right? A perversion of what is, a misuse, even, on a completely sort of philosophical idea. If we were to say God is the ground of all being, then evil would be non-being, something along those lines. If God is the author of all that is, then evil is what is not, right? Well, formal 5-point Calvinism can be summed up with the TULIP anagram, right? TULIP, T-U-L-I-P, which stands for T, total depravity. The idea that human beings are, this is Calvin's formal Calvinism, 5-point Calvinism is also it's often referred to as 5-point Calvinism for these 5 points. 1, total depravity. That's the T in TULIP. Human beings are totally deprived, completely devoid of all goodness. In the fall, we lost the image of God completely. There was no retained goodness within human beings. You will find some Wesleyan theologians, you will find many ministers who aren't super careful about how they talk about sin and the human condition, who will say, we believe in total depravity. I'm just going to help you be careful here. Wesleyans sort of believe in what total depravity and sort of don't. And this is the sort of they do. No, we do not believe human beings have retained inherent goodness to the point where we, on our own, separated from all of God's grace, have the ability to choose the good or to choose God. Okay? If you ever want to get really technical with someone like Dr. Dunning, and I hope I quote him right in this, and you come out of the free will Baptist tradition, he might want to have a conversation with you about what do we mean by free will. And the point would be we don't really have free will. Our will is also fallen. And so we not only are turned toward evil, but we want to be. We will evil in our fallen state. We are separated from God, and we want to be in our natural state. But a true believer in quote unquote free will would have to assert that the human will was something like neutral, turned neither toward good or to evil, and somehow we retain the ability to turn our will toward the good. By the way, that was one of the early heresies that was put down, that we could turn to God of our own power. And so when we talk about total depravity and say, yeah, we believe in total depravity, well, we sort of do for the hypothetical natural human being, meaning a human being in their natural fallen, and separated from grace state. Along comes the doctrine of prevenient grace, which says, and you've never seen a human being who was totally separated from God's grace, because God's grace, in at the very least, the sense of prevenient grace, the grace that goes before salvation, is at work on every human being, mitigating the full effects of the fall. In that sense, what Wesleyans really believe in is something we might want to call mitigated depravity, in that the prevenient grace of God is at work in every human being, even unregenerate, unrepentant, full-out sinners and heretics and evildoers. We probably could go so far as to say Satan worshipers, and there is some bit of God's grace, we call prevenient grace, at work in every human being, mitigating the absolute, complete, and total effects of the fall. And that prevenient grace at least makes a human heart able to receive the gospel and make a decision to follow Christ or not. And that really allows us to absolutely embrace, you are saved by grace through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is a gift of God. Your ability to have faith, your ability to turn to God, all the working of God's prevenient grace in your life to give you that ability. You'll find that, I believe Augustine of Hippo would have called this enabling grace. The grace of God that enables you to turn to God. So let's go back to TULIP, just so I finish up that. Total depravity. Now you know we don't really believe in total depravity. Wesleyans believe in mitigated depravity. The U of the TULIP would be unconditional election. And this reflects John Calvin's teaching that God from eternity chose who would be saved and who would be damned. Which somebody's going to say, well, that makes God, really, really bad. And John Calvin would have said, no, it makes God really, really good, because we all deserve hell. And the fact that he's chosen to save any of us shows how good God really is. Just so you know, John Calvin wasn't a complete nincompoop. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. And for as much as I might want to rag about the TULIP and how we're not 5-point Calvinists, that doesn't mean you should dismiss him. I think I said this before, but I think he has some of the best classical commentaries on Scripture you can get your hands on, so much so that you'll even find that in places his biblical commentaries would contradict his own systematic theology. The L in the TULIP is limited atonement. This is the idea that Christ, in fact, did not die for everyone, but he only died for the elect. What would the point be of dying for the damned? Right? You'll understand how this all flows logically. We are totally depraved, unable to make a decision for God. We don't have that ability. That's not within us. So God has made the decision. And how all this flows from the fact that God is the ultimate and only decision maker in the universe. So God has chosen from eternity who would be saved and who would be damned. Unconditional election. The limited atonement, Christ died only for the elect. And grace is irresistible. So the I in the TULIP is irresistible grace. Because if you are one of the elect, God's grace is upon you and you can't do anything about it, right? You are a recipient of God's grace through election, and therefore your life will demonstrate God's grace. This explains, combined with the perseverance of the saints, the fact that those who God has elected to salvation, the saints of God, will persevere in grace and goodness as they grow into the image and likeness of Christ. So think about this from, I'm going to use this phrase, from its psychological ramifications. If you buy into a theological system that says, I don't make a decision about being saved or not, the only way I can know that I'm saved and not going to hell is for my life to demonstrate the grace of God, then what you're going to do is you're going to work like the Dickens so that your life shows forth God's grace, because by doing so, you will be convincing yourself and everybody around you that you are one of God's elect. Which is why there is the sense within certain Calvinist circles that you really got to do a lot of good stuff. I mean, why is it that Calvinist theology has produced some of the greatest missionary ventures our globe has ever seen, right? Well, for the same reason that the Mormons have great missionary efforts, right? Or the same reason that the Jehovah's Witnesses keep knocking on doors, right? Because when your system makes that one of the ways in which you know you are saved, then you do those things which make you know you are saved. All right? And
Is that different than just exercising your faith into good works?
absolutely. What I really sort of wish is we could figure out how to get the same motivation to love and good works that those people who are psychologically motivated by their need to confirm that they are saved by so doing have, right? They have the people that buy into that system, they have this fervor to do those works because that's how they know they're saved.
Yeah. And I've seen, in some churches where we do work outside, outreach, missionary, whatever, and you have some people that have come into the church and become Nazarenes, and they may be more apt to do things than maybe some of your Nazarenes because they don't have the motivation, even though you don't want to do it for the wrong reasons, you want to exercise your faith,
Right.
and that's how I'm trying to approach it with, things I'm doing is exercising your faith.
That's right. And certainly within the model, this model, the way you confirm that you are a recipient of grace is you do these things. So it sort of ends up being a backwards way into a works righteousness religion, except you don't really believe that by doing right things you become right. It's just that by doing right things you prove that you are one of the right ones. Right?
Yeah.
And
so if you don't prove that you're one of the righteous by doing the right things, are you still considered or thinking you're saved?
Probably you're thinking you're not, because your life's not demonstrating grace. And the real problem within the system becomes, when have you done enough?
And I think a key word you have there is you prove.
Yeah.
Those are, you have to prove, like what you're saying there. Yeah.
Yeah. In the Catholic faith, and James, you know my whole past, but in the Catholic faith, I grew up most of my younger life thinking I had to do to be saved, and it had to do with what I did, not what God did.
Right. And just, I guess, for the record, that's not the official Catholic system. Right. That's not what you would be taught if you studied theology at Loyola University. You would absolutely be schooled in the merit of Christ and his atoning sacrifice and God's grace for you. I mean, that would be the formal theology you would learn. And you would find that there are absolutely plenty of Catholic priests in the world who teach that way. But there are also, I think, plenty of people who grew up with what I'll call nominal Catholicism, who have far more of a folk theology kind of mindset that your babies have to be baptized or they go to limbo. They don't really go to hell, they just go to limbo, which is nothingness, more or less. So, officially, the doctrine of purgatory was done away with. So what do we do about that?
I was glad about that.
That's a head scratcher, you know. But so you baptize your babies, you make sure you go through confirmation and first communion, and you absolutely take communion every chance you can, and you do confession and penance. I mean, you do those things again, not because the formal theology of the Catholic Church is bad. It's actually good. I mean, especially with Vatican II and John Paul II, and officially, and unless it's been reversed by the current Pope, the official theological position is that you are saved by grace, by faith in Christ Jesus. Yay for that. The Protestant principle basically has been affirmed by John Paul II as the official teaching of the Church. That doesn't mean, again, that you don't find this folk theology running rampant, with plenty of people feeling like they've got to make sure they do all the right things, perform the right rituals, participate in, and sort of work their own salvation out.
Yeah, and I bring that up because I think that I meet a number of folks who were brought up in the same type of process I was, and that is the guilt and shame process, and convincing them in the faith and trust and forgiveness of Jesus Christ is a task.
Yeah.
Because I had totally wrong picture. They had the totally wrong picture. I wish they could all be going through what I'm going through so they would know the truth.
And somewhere in there, we still have to figure out how to help motivate people to respond with good works to what God is doing inside of them in saving them.